Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Shira Schoenberg. Last week, the Boston Foundation published a report looking at housing in the Boston area, which confirmed the state's dire situation. There's not enough housing, and what there is far too expensive. Here with me today are report co-author Luke Schuster, Executive Director of Boston Indicators, which is the Boston Foundation's research center, and Scott Van Voorhis, a Boston area reporter who writes the Contrarian Boston newsletter and has covered housing policy. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Luke, we know that we don't have enough housing to meet demand in the Boston area. Can you measure that shortfall? How much more housing do we need, and what type of housing is lacking?
Yeah, there's no one definitive measure of how much housing we absolutely need. A few ways to think about it. The Metro Mayors Coalition, this coalition of 15 urban core mayors, they've set a target of building, I think it's 185,000 new units by 2035. And one thing we do in the report is just to track how we're doing a few years into that goal. And for those 15 Metro core communities, we're far behind that progress. Another way to think about the amount of housing we quote unquote need is by looking at vacancy rates. Just at any given point in time, are there enough rental units on the market so that people looking for homes can find one? We have among the very lowest rental vacancy rates of any major metro area in the country. And then it's the same on home ownership vacancy rates, again, among the very lowest among any competitor metro area in the country.
I know that, Luke, your report looked at where homes are being built. What did you find? Are there certain types of communities that are building housing and other communities that aren't?
Yeah, that's actually a nice sort of entree to one of the good news stories here, which is that permitting rates are up over the last 5 or 10 years across Greater Boston. They're not up a ton. They're not meeting the demand for all the folks who'd like to live and work in our region. But they're up nonetheless. And I think that is good news that's worth flagging. The challenge is that it's really a small subset of municipalities that are doing that new housing construction. It's really predominantly metro core communities like Boston, Cambridge, Medford that are doing most of the construction. There's a few developing suburbs that have been ramping up production too, places like Beverly and Plymouth. Communities that really haven't contributed much to our regional needs are the higher income suburbs, many of whom are served by very valuable rapid transit assets like the commuter rail. So that's one of the places I'd point our attention for opportunities for more housing construction in the future.
And we know that the legislature and the Baker administration have both really made efforts to increase the housing supply through various housing programs, changing in zoning laws. Scott, you've made the case that opposition by suburban communities has really gotten in the way of building new housing, even through some of these new programs. What are you seeing in terms of who is opposing new housing and why?
It's a mixed bag. I think it's really unequal, the level of production and who's building it. You have some communities that are very welcoming, especially the bigger urban areas. So in some ways they're picking up that need, but there are many other communities or suburban communities with T stations, rail stations that aren't doing as much. And it's just, especially the Metro West communities, the wealthier ones there, some in the South and North Shore, the same kind of demographics. There's really no single family home development going on in those communities other than tear downs, which are, taking an older home, developer comes in, tears down a 50s Cape and builds a, call it McMansion or a larger house. So that will raise prices even more and continue to takes away some of the more traditional affordable homes from those communities. So it's been a difficult, there's been a lot of cheerleading, I guess that's what I've written, by governors and, by Baker, by Patrick, by previous governors along the lines of we need to build more housing and kind of playing up the good news around that and communities cooperating, but the numbers just don't get there. And the initiatives that have been rolled out, not enough communities have taken part in them or have been that interested. And developers, they always like to complain, but they'll say, look, it's just hard. It takes too long. It's too uncertain a process, and we can't get there.
So let's look at one concrete example of this. There's a recent law that required communities that are on the MBTA to allow more dense housing near public transit. And this is a requirement that a lot of towns push back on, saying the way that this is calculated, the requirements that are placed on them just aren't doable for their communities. Scott, tell me what you've seen here. Is there a problem with this requirement? How is it intended to work, and how is it playing out practically?
The problem seems to be that communities that are, or local officials that may be already kind of on the fence about housing, maybe of the mentality our schools can't handle it, whether that's really the case or not, or whether it's more just kind of fear. It certainly comes up. Have more traffic, all the things that people typically cite when they see new development. They are looking at the new law, local officials or boards that are more skeptical and saying, well, look, why should we go along with this? I mean, we don't want to lose these grants, but it's only a few $1 million. And our newsletter has reported that, a couple times, or a couple different stories on comments made and discussions by, boards of select people and planning boards, just talking openly about, what would be the hit if we didn't do this? This sounds like having 800 new apartments in town, that sounds like a lot. I don't think we can do that. In the town of Kingston, the town administrator threw out the idea, well, maybe if we just got rid of the T station, then we wouldn't have to comply at all. We still want to comply. We want to make sure that that's the case. We're not trying to not comply, but we could still get the grants and not do the housing because no one uses the T station, which is very debatable because I've heard a lot of feedback from people saying, yes, I use it, and I don't know what they're talking about. So, but there's a sense of being overwhelmed that I don't know it's certainly there. It's real. I don't think people are making it up when they're opposing some of these projects or new ideas or new zoning. But I don't know if it doesn't seem to be always necessarily borne out by the facts. There have been studies by the Donahue Institute, other organizations that have shown that the new apartments, multifamily housing doesn't bring in a flood of kids, and it doesn't have these kinds of dramatic impacts that the opponents always cite.
Sure. One thing I'd add is I think part of what's going on is a lot of confusion about how the law actually works. Each community has a target number of units that the new zoning rules would have to allow to be built. But that's very different from a mandate that those units get built. And so I think a community often, hears that the new MBTA communities law, it requires them to have a new zone that would allow up to, say, 500 new units of multifamily housing. The best research I've seen out there from upzonings in other parts of the country is that within 5 or 10 years, only something like 5 or 10% of the new capacity actually gets built. All this is talking about is the regulations on the books. And I think it'd be helpful if we almost reversed our thinking on this. People sometimes often complain that, our housing market in Massachusetts is failing to meet the needs of families and residents in the region. And I think about it more like we don't have anything close to a free market in housing right now at all, because we've allowed very small municipalities to erect zoning rules that legally prohibit the construction of anything other than large single family homes. So anybody who owns a piece of property in the vast majority of Greater Boston right now who wants to, switch from having a single family home to a couple of townhomes or a triple decker, that's just banned outright by local zoning codes right now. And MBTA communities upzoning is just saying you'd have more options for what you'd like to do with your land if the community adopted this new zone.
And we're talking about a lack of enough housing, but Luke, one thing that really struck me in your report was that finding that when you're looking at affordable housing or subsidized housing, there's some communities that have these enormous waiting lists, which we're all familiar with. But then you mentioned there are these places like suburbs like Kingston or Situate that actually have empty units and nobody's applying. You made the case that people don't know about it or can't access it. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, a common theme both across the analysis of our market rate challenges and on the subsidized housing challenges is that we have such a piecemeal, hyper-local approach, both to market rate housing construction and to subsidized housing construction that, at best, we've just created a maze for people to navigate. And I think at worst, some people without the best of intentions use that, confusion of the system to make it very hard for people to know when there are openings for affordable housing lotteries. So for instance, any new affordable housing development has, important requirements to market the available units to a broad swath of folks. And there are some striking examples in the report of new developments in one part of the region where there's no marketing for those units anywhere nearby. And so the advertising that happens for, a new development in Andover is happening in Boston or something, but not in Lawrence, right next door. So there's a lot of work we need to do to ensure much fairer access to the available units, especially out in the suburbs of the region.
And Scott, you talked about this in one of your recent newsletters, arguing that there may be something else going on here. What do you think is leading to this imbalance?
It's hard to know, and looking forward to kind of digging into that issue even more, and appreciate the Boston Foundation for its report and bringing that up, because I think it's so important to highlighting this gap here, how we can have this mismatch between these empty units and such need and demand. And that off the bat, that would make me suspicious, having been a reporter at the Lawrence paper from years ago, that was it Andover wouldn't advertise in Lawrence. I mean, there's a dynamic there, but it could be, but who knows, right? Because there's just not enough information to know. It could be just, everybody's in their own little silo. I don't understand why you couldn't even have we live in the online age and wired age, why you couldn't have just one database that everybody could log on to. Everybody contributes. It can't be that complicated, especially you're not even talking about probably that many units, like 500 or something, to list them and get the word out and see who's interested. I mean, could also be maybe some of the permits aren't anywhere near public transportation, which I think was also mentioned in the report. They may be still too expensive, but maybe then you'd eliminate at least the idea that no one knows about them, and that's one factor you could deal with, right?
Scott, on your point about having the internet and gosh, we ought to be able to solve some of these problems, it's worth flagging that there's a really neat new nonprofit called Housing Navigator Massachusetts that over the last couple of years has been trying to fill this void by gathering property by property data for every affordable housing unit. The goal is to get it statewide. They've got pretty good coverage for a lot of the region of Greater Boston now. And they're creating what they're calling kind of a Zillow for affordable housing in Greater Boston. Yeah, which is really neat. The folks who are doing it have stressed that it's a ton of work to maintain and update, and they don't think that they can do this in perpetuity long term. And so the policy solution here is to shift it over to state government to do this at scale.
And it definitely seems like it would be a worthwhile initiative. Going back to your Andover Lawrence example, I mean, the word that we're not saying right there is race. Is an Andover development advertising, not in Lawrence because they want to attract a wider audience, wider tenants. And so I want to talk about that directly. Luke, your report finds that Greater Boston is still segregated by race and by income. Black and Latino residents are concentrated in specific communities. Whites are more likely to own their own homes. Black and Latino residents are more likely to pay a higher share of income on housing. Talk about what are some of the challenges facing the Black and Latino communities in housing that are different than those facing white residents? Is it still a matter of bias? Are there other things at play?
You've already flagged a lot of them in the framing of your question, which I really appreciate it. I'd say, something that we often lose sight of on the housing production side is that there's a growing body of historical research that's been done on the inception of local zoning codes about 100 years ago in the early 20th century. That's made it increasingly clear that many of the higher income suburban communities, both in Greater Boston and other parts of the country, chose to adopt local zoning codes explicitly to exclude people who were not like the existing residents in those places. So it was very anti-immigrant, very anti-Black at the time. This was before the wave of Asian and Latino immigrants we've seen more recently. And those are examples of racially exclusionary public policy practices that are on the books today. There's been a lot of discourse around historically racist public policies that pushed Black and Latino families out of home ownership in prior generations, things like the GI Bill and redlining that made it much harder for non-white families to build wealth and assets. Local zoning codes have a similar relic in exclusion, but by contrast, are still on the books in Greater Boston in 2022.
How does that work? How does a zoning code lead to exclusion, and how is that still legal today?
It's done sort of on its face in a race neutral way by saying you can't build anything other than, say, a single family home on a certain large lot size. What that means in practice, because Black and Latino families in particular are disproportionately low and moderate income, the types of homes that they are more likely to be looking to either rent or purchase as a first-time home are much more likely to be, a more modest townhome, duplex, triple decker. And those are the things that are literally prohibited from being built in many of our suburbs. So, and again, the connection here is that cities and towns adopted zoning codes in the first place at a period about 100 years ago when they were, explicitly aiming to keep the racially white character of their communities.
And Scott, how has race played a role in some of these housing issues that you've looked at?
Well, yeah, it definitely has. I mean, there are, I think, code words that people use that over the years, just as starting off as a young reporter covering some of these housing developments and people talking about, well, this is going to bring a lot of crime into town. And I don't want, I fled the city because I didn't want to live next to housing projects, like just apartment building, and that's been a constant theme, and that really never, I don't think, has ever gone away. But it certainly seems that there's that fear of or talk about outsiders coming in, and I think, as we all know, in the Boston area, that there's a racial element to that, right? I mean, that's what people are talking about in so many words, or seem to be. So there's that, and there's that element of kind of NIMBYism out there, I think. And it's interesting what Luke was saying, that it's fascinating going back to zoning in the early parts of the century, and how that, really had an exclusionary basis, and it continues to have, maybe not as blatant, but some towns have 1-2 acre zoning. I mean, I don't know if you could call it gentrification, but the what's happening, or the broader forces that seem to be reshaping the housing market in the Boston area, have kind of, not only is it excluding Blacks and Latinos and other groups from being able to buy housing or have a chance of buying housing in the suburbs, but it's excluding anybody who is below a certain income limit. So now we're going into this sort of almost like towns that are, especially the upper income towns, that are almost like private clubs, or you have to spend $1 million to get entrance into it. So it's almost becoming a class kind of segregation issue too. I mean, a lot of the more modest homes that are built in the 50s, 60s getting torn down, replaced by these bigger houses. It's not unique to Boston hardly either. I think it's happening in a lot of the cities that have seen lots of growth. But
so given all of these factors, we're at an inflection point in the state. We're about to have a new governor, new administration. Luke, what works? What can be done to improve the housing situation?
I think one important frame for thinking across solution opportunities is doing more of these collectively, either region-wide or, because we don't really have functioning county level government in Massachusetts, doing it at the state level. Because I think the one-off town by town approach is, ultimately not how we're going to get to greater equity and growth as a region. People live across town lines, they work across town lines. We need to broaden the sphere of influence when thinking about these public policy solutions. So to get specific, I think steps like the MBTA communities upzoning law are a step in the right direction, because it's an example of the state saying, we expect every community that's getting service by our rapid transit system to contribute something towards our shared housing needs. It's what the state was a real leader on, 60 years ago now, with the inception of 40B, doing something to expect a baseline minimum contribution of affordable housing in every community. I think we could go a lot further, but conceptually that feels like the right direction to me.
And Scott, have you seen programs that are actually working?
In terms of affordable housing or just market rate housing, or
Both. More broadly, how can communities look at approaching this? How can the state, the new administration, come up with ways to actually address the housing issue in a way that's successful?
I just think this needs to be a much tougher approach from the state to communities. And I don't know if maybe that's not even politically possible, because no governor wants to get into a feud with 200, towns and suburbs. But what we're doing isn't working. It's 20 years. I mean, we can all go back over the stories and the initiatives launched, and it's just not moving the needle the way it needs to be moved. And maybe it just continues to go on this way, and we reach sort of Silicon Valley levels of unaffordability and inequality. I just don't think that's a great future, but something needs to be done. I think Healy has laid out the idea that being so really supportive or wanting to back the MBTA communities law. The only thing my concern, and I kind of flagged down one of my stories, was that it talks a lot about getting cooperation and working with communities, and of course you want to do that, but there didn't seem to be any sticks. There seemed to be more carrots, and you could just continue to do all the happy talk to the cows come home, and it's not going to move the needle. There has to be something at stake where people are locally, local officials are going to say, look, we really don't want to lose that grant, or this doesn't look good, or this addresses our concerns about school costs. I don't know.
Luke, do you agree? Is it a matter of just getting tough on the municipalities and the suburbs?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think they need to do more, and it's not fair the way it's right now. We have kind of a scattershot approach where some communities are doing more than their share and others can kind of skate by and do nothing. And that's not fair either, right? Some people can say, look, I don't, I've heard that, though I not as, we're in Cambridge and we're getting all this, they feel they're getting hyper development, but, somebody out in 495 or Metro West is not, is blocking any new housing. So California has certainly taken a more aggressive approach, and I looked at that, and it did seem like they were having success. And more recently, we're actually passing us in terms of a crude metric I came up with: housing units per residence. It's hardly overall a success story in the California housing market, but I look at it and say we're headed there, right? So why not do that now, then wait another 10 years, and then when our backs are against the wall, having to do statewide rezoning, and I'm not an expert on it. Luke probably knows a lot about it. I don't know how much you could do on a statewide level, but it seems like that needs to be approached as opposed to just trying to convince reluctant communities. We have 300 or something towns and cities in the state. That's a heavy load to carry.
Yeah, I think the politics of this are tough. The governor's approach through MBTA communities is, to me, it's sort of trying to split the difference. It's, a statewide expectation that you create a new multifamily zone. So that's the state stepping in and expecting something. But because it leaves so much latitude to how it happens at the local level, that could be some of what's leading to some of the local backlash. I'm not the political operative to know if that was the right calculus or not. I would say I am somewhat optimistic that we're having this conversation at all. I mean, that happened alongside with the housing choice reforms that lowered the voting threshold for making certain zoning changes to, allow for just a simple majority, which I think is positive also. So if these are interim steps towards something more like what California is doing, they just legalized, for example, the construction of accessory dwelling units or backyard cottages in every parcel of land statewide. They also effectively ended single-family exclusive zoning statewide, allowing for duplex construction on any parcel statewide. So, if that's where we get 2 years from now or something, I think these will have been really important interim steps towards that, but we'll have to see.
And you can always read more on CommonWealthMagazine.org. Luke Schuster and Scott Van Voorhis, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Shira.